And now our final lecture, lecture number 20, part 2 of the two-part lecture, Parenting in a Digital Age. In part 1, as you recall, we spent a lot of our time talking about the history of the rapid development of social media and devices that we use in order to access social media, the various implications of the usage of that, some of the statistics regarding usage, and I'll say some of the same kinds of things in this lecture as well. But the area of concern that we're going to be dealing with is video games. Video games, of course, can be played on computers. That's the older way of doing it, but certainly on our cell phones as well. And there are similar kinds of things that need to be said with respect to parents recognizing how much time is actually being spent doing this, and what they may need to look out for with respect to the kinds of video games and the amount of time that children are spending on video games using their cell phones. So let's get started with a little bit of history. This is sort of like a walk down memory lane for me. I don't know if any of you have ever actually seen one of these consoles, the picture of it there, Pong. It's basically just an incredibly simple, unsophisticated table tennis game. You have two knobs that you can see on the front panel. One player controls one knob, the other player controls the other knob, and all the knobs do is to move a paddle, just one straight line, up and down on their side, and they bat that little electronic ball back and forth until somebody misses, and then the other person scores a point. That was the first mass video game available. It was not available in any kind of a portable fashion. It had to be on one of these sort of, that screen is actually like the size of a television set. And I used to play them in bowling alleys and so forth. You drop a quarter in the slot and you get to play. That was 1972, the year before, in case you wanted to know, the year before I graduated from high school. That was all the rage, and people could not get enough of it. The technology was absolutely simple compared to what we have now. It wasn't even very good. That little ball, which was, basically a few pixels, a little square that traveled back and forth across the screen, even left little ghost trails on the screen, not because they had designed it that way, but because the technology, the video technology, was so unsophisticated that there was no way to get rid of that. A few years later, Space Invaders became one of the most popular games out there that took the video to another level of sophistication. Here you can see much more than just a matter of one little ball traversing the screen back and forth. You have a whole range of little aliens that march their way across the screen and then down a level and then across the other way and then down a level, and you have to destroy all of the aliens. They are shooting at you while you have that little blue base at the bottom and you are shooting at them. You have to clear all of them out and then a new group will come. You have those four little pink bases that you get to hide behind. So as they shoot, you can hide behind that and it will wear that little base away. If you accidentally shoot it from your side, you will also wear the base away. And so eventually you have nowhere to hide, and hopefully you have got rid of all of the aliens. Now, it looks somewhat more sophisticated in as much as the aliens are now in color. But some of these earlier games, they accomplished that color by actually having colored bands on the screen, so that when the white alien would march behind that band of color, it became green or blue or whatever stripe of color was on the screen. So they still didn't, even with some of these games, have the sophistication to make it anything more than black and white. But this then, when Space Invaders and all the different varieties of this game came out, that was thought to be, wow, amazing. And again, people couldn't get enough of it. Now, this kind of technology continued to explode in the late 70s and in the early to mid 80s, so that by the time you got out to the mid 1980s, you had video arcades dotting the downtown areas of cities. In Pasadena, I used to live in Fuller student housing. There were probably 4 or 5 video arcades that would have been in walking distance of my home. Some of those are a little bit longer of a walk than others, but you could actually do it. We're talking about maybe a 2-mile radius. And I would spend lots of time in these arcades along with other students, and so did a lot of other people. This is the era in which the popular song Pac-Man Fever came out and talked about people going to an arcade with a pocket full of quarters and then just spending the evening dropping quarters into the slot of these machines and playing game after game after game. Sometimes the younger folks who were, like latchkey kids who, they come home from school and there's nobody there, they would hang out in the arcade. And they would get so good at some of these games that you had to watch out for them. They operated a little bit like sharks in the arcade. So if a guy like me went in there, and I spent my share of time in arcades, but not like these kids did. And so they may have spent hours and hours and hours and hours mastering Pac-Man, for example, if you remember what Pac-Man is. And I would go in and I'd start playing Pac-Man, and one of these kids, a 10-year-old, would come up to me and say, "Hey, you want to play doubles?" And you learned pretty quickly that the answer to that question should be no, unless you yourself were already an expert, because what would happen is you would play your turn, and your turn might last 5 minutes, and then it would be their turn, and they were so good at the game, their turn would last 3 hours. And so you figured out pretty quickly you might as well just walk away, or you're just going to spend the next 3 hours watching somebody else play on your quarter. So video arcades were all the rage, but now you don't see so many of those. They do still exist to some extent, but you don't see so many of those because the technology has advanced for people to be able to play games on their own. They don't have to go somewhere else, and you could just play games to your heart's content on a device that you pull out of your pocket. Now, of course, we are in an era in which, because of microchip technology, because of screen technology, we are able, as I've said, to play games on devices that we carry around with us. But that also means, of course, that we're a long, long way from Pong and Space Invaders and games of that era in terms of their visual sophistication. I'm just giving you one example here of one of the most popular games of recent years, Grand Theft Auto, which has come out in a number of different varieties. So in 2013 to 2015, Grand Theft Auto 5, Volume 5, was released. The reason that it's across those years is because it wasn't released on all of its available platforms at the same time. So one version was released for one platform, and then the next platform would come out a couple of months later, and so forth. This is a primary example of a sophisticated, what we call first-person shooter. In other words, you as the character go around blowing things up and shooting other characters and so forth. And it's not only a good example of how realistic visually the games have become, but also how much they have turned into big business. The game, because of its video realism, is very immersive. The violence is realistic. One of the things that has made it so controversial is that it is not only highly violent, it is highly sexualized. So there's a particularly notorious exchange in that game in which your character can have sex with a prostitute and then, having paid her, can beat her up and take the money back. These are not the kinds of games that you probably want your kids to play if you know that that's part of the game that they're playing. Now, again, this is big business. Grand Theft Auto was record-breaking in how successful it was. The very first day of its release, it made $800 million in sales. And of course, there was a lead up to that release. People who were already familiar with the earlier versions of Grand Theft Auto were just waiting for it. And as soon as it came out, $800 million the first day. First 3 days, it topped $1 billion in sales. And if you need some other kind of a media statistic to compare that to put it into context, think of Avengers Endgame, which again, as the culmination of a large, long string of movies that had all themselves been quite popular, was quite anticipated. People were buying their tickets in advance. Avengers Endgame made $1.2 billion in its opening weekend. That's pretty much the same as Grand Theft Auto did. And Grand Theft Auto, I would imagine, although I haven't actually looked this up, probably cost less to produce than Endgame did. So the profit on this is amazing. By the way, the previous record holder for opening weekend was Avengers Infinity War, if these kinds of things matter to you at all. And their opening weekend take was just over half of what Endgame did. So again, it gives you some sense of just how significant the video game industry actually has become. Video games have large, devoted followings, and again, they are really big business. One of the more recent and very popular games that a lot of people have been talking about for a while, because this has also come out in its own variations. There are, that I know of, 3 different variations of the game with different characteristics to them. Fortnite. As of the last count that I've seen, there are 250 million players on Fortnite. That's a report as of March of last year. And their revenue in 2018 was reported to be $2.4 billion. Okay, $2.4 billion for Fortnite. And not to be outdone in that regard, we're not just talking about these role-playing games or these first-person shooter games like Grand Theft Auto. What about Candy Crush Saga? Okay, one of the most popular games to be played on your cell phone, which doesn't have, you're not really shooting things or playing a character. It's just that the game is incredibly addictive. My wife started recently playing a game that has a similar format to it, and she tells me how addictive it actually is. You just keep playing and playing and playing. We'll say more about that in just a bit. Candy Crush Saga is the latest in a string of Candy Crush video games that you can play on your phone. And it is a good example of a whole new breed of games that are free to play but have in-app purchases. So they can hook you playing the game because you don't have to pay anything in order to download it and in order to play it. But there are things that you can spend money on inside the game. So power-ups of one kind or another that allow you to keep playing even though your game is supposed to be done. You've been defeated, you ran out of lives or some such thing, but you can buy more lives. You can buy another free turn or some such thing. And this is where they get you. Now, by the way, I mean, with these in-app purchases are not expensive. There are more expensive things that you can buy. But usually we're talking about something like 99 cents. Okay, so for 99 cents, I want to keep playing. I've got a long time sitting in my doctor's office waiting for my appointment, and I don't want to wait until later, so I'll spend 99 cents to keep playing. That's worth it to me. Well, think about this now. In terms of monthly active users, there are 200, at last count that I've seen, 272 million players playing Candy Crush Saga at least once a month. And according to their statistics, there are 9 million people who play the game at least 3 hours a day. 9 million people playing the game 3 hours a day. And it's because of that, even if you only get a fraction of people spending 99 cents for a power-up, It's because of that that Candy Crush Saga rakes in $2 million a day in revenue. I have thought to myself, of course, in this day and age, that this is the only thing that Fuller needs to do in order to solve all of its financial problems, is to develop a really popular game app, and then we'll be absolutely fine. $2 million a day can solve a lot of problems. I have no idea what that app would look like, but hey, it might be worth a thought. Now, if you look at all the Candy Crush apps put together, then not just Candy Crush Saga, which is more recent, but some of the other ones, in 2018, they were pulling in $4.2 million a day and raked in $1.5 billion for the year. So again, video games, whether we're talking about something you play on a console, whether you're talking about something you play on your cell phone, video games are big, big business. Now the big question then is, are video games also addictive? Is it that you've got these people, these 9 million people that are playing the game 3 hours a day? Are they literally addicted? There are users who will say that once they start playing, they really can't stop. It's hard for them to stop, and that's why they're willing to pay 99 cents to keep going. Now, as some researchers have suggested, and they're trying to think in terms of why this might be the case from the perspective of brain science, they point to the dopamine pleasure reward system in the brain and point to the fact that the way that the game is designed takes advantage of that. We are wired to enjoy meeting small goals, and again, I'll say a little more about this in just a bit, but we are wired in such a way that we enjoy meeting small goals and receiving small rewards. So think about how that would work in a game like Candy Crush. You get a row of 3 pieces of candy and it disappears and something interesting happens visually. Or you clear an entire screen and it tells you you did great or fabulous, or some such small reward is enough for us. Our brain likes that kind of stuff. It's like brain candy for us, appropriately enough. And we will keep playing to get those little hits of dopamine in our brain. And of course, after you've met a small goal, immediately speaking, you're given another goal to reach. You got rid of these 3 candies. What about the rest of them? You got rid of this screen. Here's another screen for you to clear. And so it's hard to find a place to just stop. It would be one thing if the game was constructed in such a way as to say, okay, so you cleared this screen, you've met your goal for the day, good job, we'll see you tomorrow. But of course, that's not the way it works. And that's not the way that the game designers want the game to work. They want you to keep playing. The longer you play, the more addicted you get to the game. The more addicted you get to the game, the more likely you are to spend money on it. Now, Time Magazine did a study in 2013. They surveyed 1,000 players of Candy Crush and asked them about their behaviors, and they found that 32% of the people who responded to their survey said that they ignored their friends and they ignored their family in order to play the game. And so you see how video games can sometimes take people away from social interaction. I've mentioned before how sometimes you can go into a restaurant and you see an entire family, the mom, the dad, and the kids are all on their video devices. Nobody's talking to one another. And you wonder what it is that you go to a restaurant for in the first place. Or I've seen it happen even in my own home when we've done a what we would call a family dinner. And we would have my mother come from her assisted living facility. Somebody would go and pick her up and bring her over to the house. And my wife and I would be there, and perhaps my daughter, my son lives out of state now. My daughter might come, my sister and her husband and their daughter and son-in-law and grandchild might all come. So we'd be there, and we'd have dinner, and we'd have conversation over dinner. And then as soon as dinner was over, you'd see all the cell phones come out. And people would be on their phones doing who knows what, checking their email, checking their Facebook, messaging with people, that kind of thing. Even my daughter, when she would come over and would spend time with us, anytime, even if we were in the middle of a game, we were playing a game, and she would get a text message, she would stop the game to pick up the text message and respond to it. So these kinds of games and other online experiences tend to pull us away from friends and family. 28% of the people who responded to the survey said, well, yeah, we got to admit, we played the game sometimes when we were supposed to be working, so we played at work. And 30% of them actually said, yeah, we consider ourselves to be addicted. Now, I'll say something more in a couple slides down the line on what the formal criteria for addiction might actually be, but almost a third of those 1,000 players were willing to say of themselves, I'm addicted to this game. Now we might ask, is there any formal empirical evidence that Candy Crush addiction or addiction to video games is a real thing, or is that just a word that people use metaphorically to describe their own behavior? Well, one recent study of Candy Crush addiction, if we can even call it that, of Candy Crush addiction, demonstrates that this isn't just a problem that we see in the United States, and it isn't just a problem that you see in highly technologically advanced countries, but a study was done in Pakistan in 2018 that demonstrates that this is a problem there as well. So they found, the researchers there found, that 70 million people per week play Candy Crush in Pakistan. And part of the complication here with respect to the things that have been happening in their country, and particularly in 2018, is that it wasn't safe for children to play outdoors. And so parents would keep their kids inside, and that meant that they were spending a lot more time on screens, and they were playing a lot more video games on those screens. So the researchers surveyed then 202 young adults in Lahore, in Lahore, average age just under 20 years old, and they gave them measures, and yes, there are measures of these things, measures of gaming addiction, executive functioning, and self-reported cumulative GPA. So they wanted to see whether or not these young people exhibited symptoms or behaviors that were considered addictive with respect to games, to what extent their executive centers of their brain were functioning well. Again, all these are self-report, and then what they reported of their grade point average as a measure of their academic success. And what they found was that Candy Crush addiction, the more that they, these were all players of Candy Crush, the more that they endorsed items that suggested that they were addicted to gaming, the lower their GPA and the worse off they were in 10 out of the 11 domains of executive functioning that were measured. Now, of course, you always have to ask that question. For those of you who know anything about statistics, you've heard the phrase correlation is not causation. You cannot, on the basis of that study, say that it is playing Candy Crush that created these problems in their executive functioning, because you could read the results in the other way. And that is that these people who were playing Candy Crush played Candy Crush because they were compromised in executive functioning. So either way you read it, there still seems to be an association here, a significant one, and possibly a problematic one. And this then comes back to us in terms of its implications with respect to what could be the impact upon these kids playing these games as far as their educational success in a developing economy. These games can be, at the very least, even if they didn't directly impact their executive functioning, the games are a distraction to the extent that they can't stop themselves from playing. It distracts from the time that they could be devoting to their studies, possibly interfering with their executive functioning. To the extent that they are not then either focusing on their studies or developing the cognitive capacities that they need, then they are not going to do well in school, and in a developing economy, that is not good news. The opportunities are not going to be there for them. And the parents in that economy and in that culture themselves are having a tough time keeping up with the pace of technological change. If it's true that here in the United States, I could address a group of Chinese pastors and have them say to me they had no clue about any of this stuff, I can easily imagine that if you gathered together a group of parents in Pakistan and tried to give them some of this information, they too would say they had no idea that any of this stuff was actually going on. Now, does this meet then the formal criteria for addiction, and particularly for gaming addiction? Certainly what some people are wanting to say is that it is at least similar to what we see in addiction in other areas, and therefore the supposition is probably the same thing going on in the brain. But we do not, as of yet, have a fully formal diagnostic category for this. There is a diagnosis called Internet Gaming Disorder, which was proposed to be included in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You have to love a title like that. For those of you who are training to be therapists, you already know what the DSM is. If you are not training to be a therapist, the DSM is sort of like the psychiatric Bible, if you will, in which, and this is typically true if somebody comes for counseling and they're trying to get insurance reimbursement for that counseling, there needs to be some kind of a formal diagnosis, and this is the manual that houses the diagnoses and the criteria for meeting those diagnoses, along with a numeric code that you would use on your insurance form to say what your client was diagnosed with. So this is a proposed diagnostic classification. They have not formally included it because it still requires further research. But the criteria that they listed in the proposal are instructive because it demonstrates how the various aspects of addiction could apply to a gaming disorder. So just going down the list here, is the person preoccupied with gaming so that they not only play it, but they keep thinking about it? Do they experience withdrawal when the game is taken away or when they are, for some other reason, unable to play? So imagine what happens when your GPA goes down and your parents say, okay, we're going to use a certain kind of punishment in which I take away privileges, so you may not play your game for a week or something like that. And the kid may actually experience withdrawal symptoms. Similar kind of thing may happen even if the parents don't take it away, if their game console is broken or the power is out or some other thing gets in the way of their being able to play. Like other addictions, like substance addictions, they seem to develop a certain kind of a tolerance. That means that with drugs, it takes more and more of the drug to get high. Here, with tolerance for a process disorder like gaming, it means that you have to play longer to satisfy the urge to play. When people are addicted, they have tried perhaps to stop. They have tried to play less and they can't do it. Maybe they can do it for a day, but they just can't keep it up. They lose interest in other activities, even in the activities that they used to enjoy. They continue to play the game, even though there have been negative consequences and they've faced various kinds of problems and they're aware that it's linked to the game, they keep playing. If you ask them, if a mom or dad asks them how much time they've been spending playing the game, they hide the truth. They lie to their parents about how long they've been playing it. They increasingly turn to games in order to relieve negative moods. So maybe they're feeling guilt or anxiety or hopelessness, all of which, of course, can come along with the hormonal changes that come in adolescence, and they may be turning to gaming in order to just escape from those moods, at least for a little while. And often, one of the criteria for any kind of an addiction is that the addictive behavior leads to various kinds of losses and severe consequences. People have lost jobs over their addictions. They have lost relationships over their addictions, or are at risk for doing that. And the same thing can be true of being addicted to gaming. So all of this paints a fairly negative picture, but one that, quite frankly, a lot of people might actually fit. And so the research is still underway to decide whether or not internet gaming disorder could fruitfully be included in the next edition of the DSM. Now, I've already hinted at this language, but let me bring out the terminology here and explain it if you're not familiar with it. The difference between a process and a substance addiction. People already know, and there's been quite a bit of research on the neurological mechanisms of substance addiction. So addictions to cocaine or heroin or prescription medication, or quite frankly, nicotine in cigarettes, which has been demonstrated to be more addictive than heroin even, as opposed to a process addiction in which you aren't actually ingesting any psychoactive substances. So gambling is probably the primary example of that, or people who are addicted to watching online pornography are a couple of the common ones, and then gaming has been included in that category. So there is some research that is beginning to demonstrate that some of the same neurological, neurochemical things are happening in your brain to people who are addicted to substances as in the brains of people who are addicted to processes like an overuse of digital media. So you have the same, as I mentioned before, you could be playing Candy Crush, you get the same hit, little pleasurable hit of dopamine, an important neurotransmitter in the pleasure center, the pleasure process of the brain. And this kind of regular dopamine hit can lead you to a place where you anticipate that and then begin to crave it and need it and depend on it, so that you don't feel right if you're not getting that hit of dopamine. And the only way to do that is to go back into whatever the addictive behavior actually is. So we're still at that place of trying to determine just to what extent you see all the same physiological mechanisms, but the research is pretty suggestive at this point that it may have the same underlying substrate as getting addicted to any other substance that we would worry about and that we would want laws to regulate. One of the interesting theories that has been put out regarding this is the idea of what have been called supernormal stimuli, in the way that they hook those dopamine systems of the brain. You can think of it this way. One of the examples that I've heard given is that there is a certain kind of a fish called a stickleback fish, and when the male stickleback sees a female stickleback who is fertile, ready to reproduce, the stickleback fish will mate with her and will fight off any other stickleback that gets in the way. Now, what happens with the female stickleback when she is ready to reproduce is she begins to turn red, not out of embarrassment as far as I know, but she begins to turn red, and this becomes the stimulus to the fish to engage in mating behavior and to aggressively fight off any other challengers to the female. Now, you know, who knows why people get the motivation to actually do these kinds of studies, but one of the things that some researchers have done is to say, okay, so what is it about the appearance of the female that signals to the male stickleback that it's time to do this? And is it the shape? What is it? And so they've tried different kinds of things. They would try doing a cutout of a female stickleback and stick it down into the tank with the male, and the male doesn't even bother with it. By process of elimination, what they found was it was the color red that really did it. It was the color of the female. And it didn't have to be a cutout of a stickleback fish colored red. It could be anything that was red would set off this reaction in the stickleback. Even to the accidental extent that there was as one experimenter tells it, there was a red truck parked across the street that the fish could see from inside the tank, and the fish started slamming itself against the side of the aquarium, trying to get at the red truck. Okay? Now, what does this have to do with the idea of supernormal stimuli? The idea here is that in normal life, in the way that God created the earth and human beings, we only get certain kinds of stimuli in the natural environment every once in a while and for particular reasons. So it's not like a male stickleback fish meets something red or meets a red female every day of his life. When he does, he instinctually knows what to do about that. But we have an environment in which we can introduce into his environment something that is not natural to him. And because we can do it in a way that supersedes what he would normally experience in his natural environment, we can elicit an even stronger reaction. So we can do brighter and more concentrated colors of red and elicit a more aggressive reaction from the fish. Okay? This is a super normal stimulus. Now, the application of that is pretty far reaching. Some people have said, so think about why it is that we get addicted to junk food, right? Those who take an evolutionary perspective would say that we have cravings for certain kinds of food because if you think about what it means to be a hunter-gatherer and living on a subsistence diet and not always knowing whether or not you are going to be able to find food this season, this day, this week, whatever it is. To some extent, for example, we crave fat because we need fat to store up in our bodies to tide us over when there is no food supply. And some of that changed when we went to an agrarian economy, when then food became relatively reliable in a way that it wasn't for hunter-gatherers. But people who produce junk food know what consumers like. And to some extent, what they're doing is they're tapping into innate preferences that we already have, that we have been evolved to have. So a preference for fat, a preference for sugar, and so forth. And then they create a food that you wouldn't find in your regular environment that has all the characteristics that we would intrinsically crave anyway. And this is what makes those foods sometimes particularly addictive, because we get from that an experience that we normally wouldn't get from real food. Or you think about, and this is even more relevant to our playing of video games, you think about these shooter games and how we go through a screen and it is somehow satisfying to shoot these aliens or whatever else it is that we're shooting in Grand Theft Auto, human beings actually, and all kinds of games in which we shoot either other characters or abstract entities and so forth. Why is that so satisfying? It's because if you live in a hunter-gatherer society, shooting your survival depends upon that. And it is satisfying to be able to successfully shoot something, but it's something that happens once in a while, right? What if you are put into a virtual environment in which you are constantly shooting things and having the satisfaction of actually hitting the goal? Now, intermediate to that, the illustration that has sometimes been given that I have experienced myself is I still miss the days in which my son and I used to play basketball out in the front driveway. But when we redid the roof on our house, we didn't put the basketball goal back, and my son grew up and moved away and so forth. So I haven't been able to hold a basketball in my hand for a number of years, unless I find one in the church gym or something like that. And I cannot tell you how satisfying it is to me personally to have the experience of having a basketball in my hand. And you can't see me doing this as you are watching this video, but I'm sitting here in front of the microphone with my arms up like I'm shooting a basketball, because it's that it's that ingrained in me. The satisfaction of being able to stand out beyond a three-point line and swish that basketball through the net, and after that feeling of yes, fist pumping, and you go and grab that basketball and run back out to the three-point line and shoot another one and another one and another one. It has the characteristic of addiction to that. And if you multiply that by 100 and by 1,000 to a video game in which you are constantly shooting things, you might understand why it is that those little, small, cumulative experiences of having that dopamine hit while we're playing the game can become so addictive. So what's the upshot of all of this? I think one way to say it is that profit-motivated technological innovation, and I think it's important for us to remember that it is profit-motivated. People are not just developing new technology for our health and benefit, but they develop it hoping to make money off of that and looking for the next big market. That kind of technological innovation has had some positive results to it. Children have access to things that help them be able to do things that they couldn't have done before. I think of it in terms of what happened many years ago when I wrote my dissertation and was doing the background research for that. I had to go into the library stacks and literally year by year pull down volumes of journals, professional journals, and take them to the Xerox machine and Xerox them one at a time so that I could have them and take them home and read them, as opposed to having access to all kinds of digital resources online that make it almost irrelevant to visit an actual physical library and spend time gathering those resources. So those kinds of things are quite valuable for students and for their academic work. But with things like video games and all the different sites and social media programs and so forth that you have access to on, again, a piece of technology that you have in your pocket, that presents rapidly evolving challenges for parents to, first of all, be aware of, and then secondly, to be able to manage. Because if parents aren't even aware of the kinds of things that their children are confronted with, the kinds of decisions that they have to make, the kind of so-called clickbait that gets thrown at them as they are navigating the digital world, then parents aren't even going to be able to be managing the consequences of that. Now, of course, video games have been around for a long time in different forms, as I've shown you, whether we're talking about Pong and on from there. The implication of a video game that you have to go to a place to play versus something that you can play at home on game consoles or on your phone or on the computer. And of course, game consoles themselves have become much, much more sophisticated over the years. Even early on, the research was generally critical of children playing video games too much, spending too many hours doing that, and then documenting the negative outcomes that come along with that. So children who spent too many hours playing video games tend to do more poorly in school, were more likely to be obese, and so on. Since then, with the advent of new technology and newer games, more research, of course, has been done, and with the increasing sophistication of the games that we have now, the findings are, in fact, a little bit more complex. So if you remember what I said on an earlier slide, that whole idea of trying to keep the larger context of there being both benefits and risks, then the research about video games seems to present some of the same sort of mixed results. So here's the good news to begin with. Let's start with the good news and then we'll talk about the bad news. There is some research, for example, that suggests that video gameplay is associated with some positive increases. So positive increases in creativity by requiring them to do creative problem solving. So some of what you have to do in video games, even if you're talking about a violent shoot 'em up game, is requiring you to think and to plan and to strategize, and that can actually be a good thing. It's associated with increases in visual spatial reasoning, as done in a particular study. And I don't know who dreams these things up, but the design of the study was to have college students play 25 minutes of Halo, and then they were given a piece of information from academic geology about plate tectonics. And they were better able to understand and pass a quiz on that piece of writing about plate tectonics when they had played Halo, because they were supposedly better able to visualize what that article about the movement of plates in the Earth's crust was trying to describe. Video gameplay can be associated with increases in the speed of visual search and visual processing, since you have to be able to take in a screen full of objects and information and make quick discriminations about where things are and what you should do. And they've actually found that with that increased ability in visual search and processing, that dyslexics have been helped in their reading ability by playing video games. That's some of the good news. What about the bad news? Well, the bad news is, and some of this should not be surprising, video gameplay is associated with decreases in school performance, particularly if we're talking about kids who spend a lot of time playing violent video games. There was a correlational study done in 2009 which found that students who played more violent or more hours of violent video games also then had more problems as reported by parents on the child behavior checklist. There was an experimental study that was done in 2010 in which the demonstrated evidence was that video gameplay had opportunity costs. In other words, just the spending of all of those hours playing a video game meant that you were not spending those hours doing other things that could be productive in some way. For example, educational activities and so on, so that those wasted hours ended up in lower reading and writing scores and also, again, increased reports of problems, this time not by the parents, but by the teachers. And there is also some evidence that suggests that violent video games may also lead to more aggressive ways of thinking about who you are, your own self-concepts, more hostile ways of thinking about other people. If you spend hours a day thinking about the other characters on the screen, you identify with your own avatar on the screen, but the other characters are enemies and you're supposed to treat them as enemies and shoot them, it's not a terrible surprise that this might actually change some of the way that you think in the outside world as well. One other domain that it's worth thinking about when we're talking about video games is what have been come to be called massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs, or sometimes just RPGs. RPGs, role-playing games like World of Warcraft, that image on your slide is from that game, require people to take a particular avatar on screen, identify with them, they become you, your alter ego on the screen. You play the game in order to level up, to increase in abilities. Sometimes you have to pay money for those abilities. So you get very, very invested in the character itself. And the idea of a massively multiplayer online role-playing game is that people not only take on these roles, but they do so in concert with other people who are taking on roles. And you could be talking about games that may have, excuse me, hundreds or thousands of players playing at the same time. Now, what some have said then is that the immersive quality of those kinds of games, both in terms of what you can see on the screen that seems so realistic, in terms of the stories that you inhabit, and stories are always compelling, whether we're talking about online or any other kind of stories. It's just the way their brains are built. These are often stories of battle-based fantasies, so if you are a big fan of Star Wars or a big fan of Lord of the Rings, there are, of course, numerous video games that are based on those stories and, again, are battle-based fantasies. There is a psychological lure to playing these games. It gets kids in deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, we've already suggested some of this when we were asking questions about people taking on a second character, an avatar in a game like Second Life, where you become someone else, married to somebody else, possibly having romantic relationships with somebody else, or at least your avatar is. Part of the reason for that is that these avatars allow you to create more of an ideal self. Nobody knows who you really are. Nobody knows your characteristics, your hang-ups, the things that you don't like about yourself. You can go online, take on a new identity, and build that identity to be what it is that you want. And this is part of the draw then of leveling up, of playing the game enough or spending enough money to make your character more powerful, more admirable, more able to succeed in the various kinds of missions that you have in these MMORPGs. Now, there are some complications then that come along with that cooperative play that you might not anticipate when you first get into it. So a team of people may gather together to go on a mission, and there are guilds that are built out of teams of people, and there are typically in some games guild masters, somebody who directs the action and decides not entirely individually, but decides what missions are going to go on while the individuals are off trying to level their characters up and then come back and serve the mission. So there's now that sense that it's not just that you need to be more capable or more powerful just for the sake of your own private, individual, egoistic motives. There is now that sense that says, I'm going to be irrelevant to this group unless I'm powerful. Nobody's going to want me to be part of their team unless I'm powerful. Some people have had the same experience in gym class. You know, when it comes time to choosing up who's going to be on what team, there's always the kid who gets picked last. And the same thing can happen in your online role-playing environment, where you worry that you are largely going to get overlooked or ignored if your character can't really do something that the team needs you to do. And of course, that also means that once you join that team, you can't let them down. You need to show up for games. And one of these unanticipated consequences is that sometimes these teams or these guilds are made up of players who live in vastly different parts of the world, and so they're on different time clocks. And a guild master who starts a mission that might be in the middle of the day for him or her, more likely to be him than her. There are more males who play these games than females, although social apps and so forth tend to be more populated by females than males. That's just one of the differences that you find in the demographics. But whoever the guild master happens to be, they may be starting something that's in the middle of the day for them, but it could be in the middle of the night for somebody else who's also on that team, and that means that they have to play when they should be sleeping. And so for some kids who are really deep into these games, that's one of the reasons why they're not getting any sleep, because they can't let their team down. They can't be viewed as non-cooperative or not helpful, and so they sacrifice sleep for that. And there have been cases, just like we've talked about with a kind of a Facebook revenge, you say something on Facebook that somebody takes exception with, and they don't just flame you online, they actually seek you out and beat you up or attack you in some ways. And there have been cases of that in video games. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Again, imagine that you have spent hundreds of hours and possibly hundreds of dollars making your character more and more and more powerful and more and more and more popular, and then in one game somebody does something to kill your character off and you have to start all over again. That is a traumatic experience, and sometimes people find ways to find out who that person is that did that, and they come and they seek you out and they get revenge on you physically in some way. So how do we draw all this then to a conclusion? We've talked a lot about social media. We've talked about video games. Those are just two aspects of the digital environment, the digital world that we live in now. So what are some of the recommendations that we might be able to make to parents, and then figure out how we can change the way that we manage the digital world in our homes? So the first question that we need to ask is how digital devices affect family life and child development. I've suggested this already, but here's a term for it. Some people say it this way, that parents use devices as shut-up toys. It used to be the television set. Now it doesn't have to be the television set anymore. All you do is just hand over your iPhone and let your kids play apps on that. And it's remarkable to see at how early an age children can actually learn to manipulate the icons on an iPhone and call up the game that they want to play and play that. Parents know that if I need to have a little peace and quiet, or I need to get something done and I just don't have the time or the energy or the wherewithal to pay attention to my child as they need to be paid attention to, just hand them a device. Hand them an iPad to watch a movie on, hand them a phone to play games on. The problem with that, as we probably have experienced already, is that that kind of digital use tends to isolate people from each other. To the extent that children need an ongoing relationship of attunement and care with their parents, then the more time that they spend on digital devices, particularly when they're being used as shut-up toys, the less they are learning that the relationship with their parent is one in which you have somebody that you can rely upon to be there for you, to understand you, to help you process what you're experiencing, to calm down, to internalize self-soothing, to learn emotional intelligence, all of those different kinds of things. And some have argued that some children, because of the usage of devices in their home, are actually being socialized more by media than they are by their parents. Now, this is why it's important to not just think about this in terms of, so here's 5 rules for digital media or some such thing, but to get parents to understand what we've said in earlier lectures in terms of the importance of an emotional tie between the parent and the child and a secure attachment relationship. Because it's not just, well, as long as I take care of my child's needs, they'll be fine. As long as I feed them and clothe them and all of that, they'll be fine. No, they need you to interact with them. They need to see you as a model of somebody who knows how to navigate the world and navigate their own emotions. And the truth of the matter is, again, with the speed of development of these devices and of the technology, we are only beginning to understand how this new digital world that we live in is going to change the way that we learn, the way that we think. One example of that, I put it up there as the relationship between having a GPS and using Google Maps, and the experience of London cabbies. If you know the story of London cabbies, because they're a typical example of how the brain is neuroplastic, London cabbies have to go through a really remarkably rigorous examination process to become a cabbie in the city of London, because you basically have to know the whole city and where everything is and how to get there. And you have to have all of that in your head so that if you encounter traffic somewhere, you automatically know in your head what the alternate route to the customer's destination is. That's very different from the way that most cab drivers, and I probably should avoid the language cabbies, because cab drivers actually don't like the term cabbies, But cab drivers in America don't have to go through that same rigorous process. What do? They use their GPS. They use Google Maps. They bring out some other kind of map to help them find where they're supposed to go, and they're looking at that even while they're driving, right? What's been demonstrated is that cab drivers in London having to learn all of that, you can actually see a growth in their brains of the areas that store this kind of memory. When they stop driving cabs, that portion of their brain begins to shrink back in size. But you see how the brain adapts to having to have that much learning crammed into it. Now, you know what happens when we start to rely upon GPS and we start to rely upon Google Maps. And this is, again, where we're only beginning to scratch the surface on how much we know about this. If you don't have to know how to get somewhere, but you always rely on your device to get you there, you stop learning how to think. You stop learning the importance of knowing where you are physically in your environment and how to navigate from one place to the next. So that's just a metaphor then, in some ways, of the questions that we might have, of the ways in which reliance and over-reliance on digital technology may change our world in ways that we have not anticipated. They go way beyond just the convenience in accomplishing particular tasks that we used to have to take more effort to accomplish. One of the big questions that I've asked throughout is whether or not parents are good role models. So it's not then just about, so how do I set limits and what are the right kinds of limits to set on my children? But what do children see in your digital uses? There have been some reports that have said teenagers aren't as wedded to their devices as sometimes we think they are. There are a number of young people who have wanted to use their devices less. Problem is, they don't see their parents trying very hard with that. Their parents are sometimes the ones who have their cell phones at the dinner table and are the first ones to jump on the computer as soon as dinner is over, and so on and so on. So we have to ask that question. And if we're going to be educating parents in this regard, we have to have them ask this question of themselves. Do parents lead a balanced and well-rounded life apart from the use of digital devices? Yeah, we get it. For some people, their businesses depend on their being able to get information quickly through their digital devices. But is their life well-rounded overall? Because if it isn't, and that's the kind of model that we're providing for our kids, how do we expect them to be able to do it? Very concrete questions. Who has the phone out at the dinner table? What pictures do parents post on social media? Do they post pictures that others might consider embarrassing or inappropriate? Then again, how do you expect your children to not do that? So parents need to take a really hard look at themselves first, change their own habits before they start making demands on their children that are beyond what they demand of themselves. Beyond just the question of trying to manage the usage of digital devices, what does a family do to prioritize healthy activity? Do you ever go outside to do anything? Okay, yeah, I get it. In the time of pandemic, this is not the kind of thing that you probably spend a lot of time doing. But let's just assume for a moment that one of these days that's going to be over. Do families ever do anything outside? Do families ever do anything together? Is it all about everybody going their separate way and doing their own thing? It's a good thing for families to play together. It's a good thing for families to be outside in the fresh air and the sunlight. It's a good thing for families to have meals together. There's actually evidence of that families that eat together have a number of different positive benefits that come from that. Does a family have regular and safe spaces for conversation? What does that look like? It could look like a family meeting, as we talked about with the Adlerian approach to parent education. But are there even those spaces for it to happen? Does a family prioritize things? Or there's that one phrase that I love, and I don't remember where I got it from, but it is, be where your butt is. In other words, if you happen to be in a room with other people, be in the room. Be with the other people. Don't be on your phone and apart from them because you are engaged in interacting with somebody who's not even there. Texting with them, emailing, checking to see how many likes you got on your Facebook page, and so forth. Because if you're not where your butt is, if your attention is not there, you might kid yourself into saying, I'm here, when you really aren't. There's this whole myth of multitasking that says, yeah, I got it. I'm paying attention. I hear, I understand the conversation and that kind of thing. But the idea of multitasking, as least as it is commonly understood, I can pay attention to two things at the same time, is really a myth. What they've demonstrated in terms of brain physiology is what we're actually doing is rapidly switching our attention back and forth between competing things that are competing for our attention. We are not paying attention to both things at the same time. And it doesn't take long before we miss or misconstrue things that happen in a conversation because we're only catching half of it, if that, if we're paying attention to what's on our phones. So be where your butt is. If you're in a room with people, if you need to excuse yourself to do something, go and excuse yourself and take care of it. But when you're in the room, be in the room. What about setting limits? Some people have said, well, we know particularly what doesn't work, and that is if parents start panicking about the time that their kids are spending on social media or with video games, and they start creating all kinds of restrictive rules and limitations, that's not going to work. Kids will not only rebel, they'll find ways to sneak it when you're not paying attention. So one writer has talked about there are enablers, there are limiters, and there are mentors. So the enablers are, I'm going to give you a cell phone and you can do whatever you want with it, and I don't care. The limiters are, well, I might give you a cell phone, but you're going to have to follow my rules, and I'm going to always be paying attention, and you can't do this and you can't do the other. And then there are mentors. The mentors are the parents who recognize what the potential risks are and help a child to understand what those risks are. They are good role models. They demonstrate the kind of behavior that they would like to see in their children, and they interact with them over the use of digital media. Now, that does not exclude, of course, setting some limits, but those limits have to be things that children understand why they're there. And again, don't think of it as hypocrisy. So how do you help parents be mentors to kids with respect to setting limits rather than just setting the limits by themselves? And can a family make agreements that apply to everyone in the family so that, again, there's that sense of modeling and of consistency and not hypocrisy? One writer talks about having a positive digital floor plan that makes monitoring possible. So, for example, where are the digital devices, the computers, the smartphones? Where are they when the family is together? Does every child have a computer in his or her own room? Well, unless you're planning to put some kind of monitoring software on the computers or watch over their shoulders, you don't really know what they're doing with that. It might be a better idea to have one computer and work out a schedule for people to use it and have it in the living room or have it in some place where it's easier to monitor that usage. And that's true of everybody and their computer time, that they're out there in a shared space, in a public space, instead of behind a locked door somewhere. What do you do with your cell phones? There are some families that have made an agreement that says, okay, we have our phones individually, but when we walk in the door, we put our phones in a charger, and then we don't touch them until we leave the house again. Now, maybe that's a little bit of an extreme policy for some families to even be able to imagine, but the point is they've taken seriously the fact that digital devices pull us away from being with each other, and if we all follow the same policy, we've got a better chance at being able to actually be where our butt is and spend time with each other. And I've mentioned the idea of, how on-screen time can interfere with sleep. Some sleep researchers will suggest that any device that emits blue light, which includes pretty much any electronic device with a screen that we watch that triggers wakefulness in the brain, and it interferes with the sleep that we need to be able to function at our best the following day. And you can talk about all the other consequences that go along with that, because then if we're not fully rested the following day, what a lot of us will do is self-medicate with caffeine, and then we start to develop a tolerance for caffeine and have more of a problem sleeping at night, and then we have more caffeine and more screen time, and on and on it goes in a vicious cycle. So the recommendation is you should stop using screens at least an hour in advance, better if 2 hours in advance of the time when you're supposed to be going to sleep. Again, that'll be a challenge for a lot of families, but it might be something that you can work up to. Beware of how the use of screens is interfering with your much needed sleep. Another way to think about it is to have positively worded pledges and stewardship contracts, just something like a family motto with respect to digital media. What is it that we are about? We are about being together as a family and making sure that we manage our digital devices in a way that doesn't interfere with our togetherness, or some other such thing, something that everybody can subscribe to and remember when they're trying to figure out what they should do next. Now, with good role modeling, with parents being the kinds of models of good digital habits to their children, and with secure attachment relationships, as we've talked about in previous lectures, parents and children probably should have no difficulty in being able to agree on shared family policies that express the values that they have together. But again, remember, this is a matter of not putting the cart before the horse. You can try to enforce a policy as a parent that you think the family should have, but that policy may not go as well or as far as you would want if you yourself are not a good role model, and if you haven't fostered a secure attachment relationship with your children. So first things first, be a good model and have secure relationships with your kids. So with all of that then, parents need to be helped to evaluate their own priorities regarding their own usage of digital technology. They need help in making sure that their digital activities don't crowd out the other kinds of healthy activities that they should be engaging in, either as individuals or as families. You, as an educator, can help your parents who come to you to be more positively involved and more active in their children's lives. Don't assume that just because they're being entertained by their cell phones that they don't need you. They may be wanting more time with you as their parents, but as long as that's not happening, I've got my phone and that will be enough. And you can also think about, as an educator, how you can help parents and how you yourself can help get the conversation going in their churches and in their communities about digital devices and their usage and their effects upon families and the parent-child relationship. So here's your final assignment other than the term paper for the course. I want you to consider the potentially problematic ways in which you've seen families use digital media, whether we're talking about social media, screen time, gaming, the isolation that causes, and so on. Tell a story about something you've observed directly. Maybe, again, it's going to a restaurant and seeing a family, none of whom are talking to each other, all of whom are staring at a screen. Then describe what you would want to say to these parents if they were to attend a seminar on parenting in a digital age. Now, maybe you haven't seen anything like that you can write about and comment on, so here's an alternative to that. Observe your own habits, because certainly you have some. What potential concerns do you have about your own digital usage, especially if you were to imagine keeping the same habits with children in the household? Now, you may already have children in the household, so you can answer the question directly, but is there something that you might change if you anticipated that you were going to have children next year? What would you begin working on now and why? That's your final writing assignment for this course.